Hello and welcome to Bergkamp Wonderland Arsenal Book Special. On the pod tonight, we'll be speaking to Dave Seager regarding his book Geordie, Armstrong on the Wing from Legends Publishing, written in collaboration with Geordie's daughter, Jill Armstrong. Dave, pleasure to have you on. How are you?
I'm very well and delighted to be on. Thank you very much for asking.
Fantastic. It's great to have you on, and especially with a book about such an important guy. So let's get straight to it. Who is Geordie Armstrong?
Well, Geordie joined the Arsenal in 1961 as a 17-year-old, but he played for Arsenal from 62 through to 1977. So, sort of 16-year playing career from the age of 17 through to when he left in 1977. He was effectively a traditional winger initially, but became much more of a box-to-box winger. But he always played on the wing for Arsenal. He could kick equally well, and nobody will tell you, as they couldn't with Santi, which is his best foot. He played right wing or left wing. He did play predominantly, however, on the left. And obviously took Arsenal with his teammates from obscurity and nowhere land for 17 years to their first trophy in 1970, and then obviously the double in 1971. So part of the first great Arsenal team of the modern era, at least. And then obviously later on, he returned to Arsenal for 10 years before his untimely death as reserve team manager, under one of the few that survived the tenures of Graham, Rioch and Wenger. Him and Pat Rice, really, and Bob Wilson, but a lot, So he was 17 years a player and 10 years a coach. So in the grand scheme of things, not too many players or individuals will have served Arsenal as long as that, perhaps only Pat Rice.
Fantastic. I mean, that gives us some idea of how important his role has been in the club. You mentioned that 71 double winning side. A lot of Arsenal fans nowadays really don't appreciate where we've come from as a club. As I understand it, Jill started this as a tribute to her father, a daughter's tribute to her father, and you became involved. Can you give me some background on that, please, mate?
Yeah, well, really, for those who don't know, I mean, Geordie was a very, very fit man, and it was a massive shock to everyone, obviously not least his family, when he suffered a very untimely death on the training pitch at London Colney at the age of only 56. And at the time, Jill's brother Tom, Geordie's son, his fiancée was pregnant, and Jill was about to be married, and it sort of dawned on her that the future grandchildren would never ever know this wonderful man, not just a wonderful footballer and a wonderful football man, but just an absolute gentleman. And she just wanted to have something that when they were older, the future grandchildren were able to read and sort of realise just how special their grandfather that they never met was and had been. So she began at the funeral, through the Islington Gazette, through the club, appealing for fans, former teammates, players who he'd coached to sort of send in letters of their memories, their recollections, their tributes of Geordie, and with the intention of producing a book. But it just got a bit too personal and life took over. So in 2001, the sort of project just sat on a shelf for 12 years. And it was only in 2013 when Jill went on Twitter and started tweeting a few photos of her dad in action. She perhaps realised very swiftly how much love there still was out there for him, because the reaction was so warm and so instant that she thought, well, perhaps she should revive the original idea. Initially, she was thinking maybe to write a couple of blogs, and she spoke to, on Twitter to people, and luckily, two individuals, primarily at Goona 1947, Peter, said to Jill, well, if you want to use anyone to write a blog, use Dave Seager. Thank you very much, Peter. So she approached me on Twitter. I contacted her as she asked me to. She told me what she had in mind, and I said, to be honest with you, you should be true to your original thought and do a book. Don't do a couple of blogs, because your father's worth more than a couple of blogs. But I was very honest and said, look, I'm just an amateur writer. I do it as a hobby. I'm not a professional writer. I have a day job. Shouldn't you approach, a John Cross or a Steve Stammers, an Arsenal journalist, because I'm sure they would bite off your right arm, to write a tribute or a biography of sorts to your father. And she said, we don't want a writer to write it. We want a fan to write it. There we are. So lucky me. So I went to meet them in November last year. When I say them, it was Jill and her Geordie's widow, Marge. And we hit it off straight away, and that's where it started.
Fantastic. I mean, one of the things you said there, you talk about the fans and players' regard for him. I mean, all too often nowadays, I hear players being called legends of the club, and to me, it's nonsense. But 27 years at the Arsenal as a player, a successful player, as a successful coach, Geordie Armstrong is a true Arsenal legend. You
Yeah,
know,
no, absolutely.
what are your favourite stories about, that you've heard while you've been doing the book of his time at the club? Give us one of those.
Well, there's lots of favourite stories. I mean, the ones about him, his ability as a footballer are, if it wasn't for the fact they were so magnanimous, they could be repetitive. But everybody will tell you that with either foot he could put a cross on a matchstick. You know, virtually 2/3 of the goals that took us to the double in '71 he made. Unfortunately, you don't have assist records back in the day, but if you speak to his teammates, as I did, they would all tell you that the double wouldn't have happened without Geordie. The first trophy they won, the Fairs Cup final, everybody I spoke to said he was the man of the match in the second leg. You know, it was like having 12 players on the pitch. That was what Geordie was like. But if I'm entirely honest, some of the best stories came from the younger lads who he coached when he was reserve team manager, and just runs through the book the complete selfless nature of the man. The first thing people will tell you is teammates like Frank McClintock, Bob Wilson, any of those guys, Charlie George, they will say it was always about other people. It was never about him. You know, whether it was, you know, a pass on a pitch, whether it was a journalist chatting to him saying you had a great game, Geordie, he would say instantly, yeah, well, maybe, but what about Charlie George? What about George Graham? He was always about other people. And he wasn't a big drinker, but he always wanted to buy the first round. If people didn't stop him, he would buy the second round. It was just, everybody you speak to at whatever level of the game, it was all about, he was just the nicest man you'd ever meet. And he treated everybody the same, whether he was speaking to a man on the street or the Queen of England, it wouldn't make any difference to Geordie. It was just, everybody was to be treated the same and with the utmost respect. And that's just what comes through whoever you speak to. It's quite phenomenal, actually.
A lot of the quotes I've read about him, it really shows the love that his teammates and the fans had for the guy. What sort of man do you feel, you know, he was as a player?
It was the phrases you'll hear in different ways would be, you know, any team playing against an Arsenal side with Geordie in, it was like playing against 12 men. You know, it just wasn't fair. He was just so dynamic, so full of energy, just ran and ran and ran. You know, the closest thing I could think of in the modern era, you know, ignoring Sanchez, would be a Ray Parlour. Just literally tireless energy from the first minute to the last. Freddie Lundberg would be the same, but Geordie was even ahead of those, miles ahead, everyone would say so. And it was always about the team. It was never about him as an individual. But that was the thing with the 1971, the 1970 and 71 side. It wasn't the quality of the individuals, it was the quality of the team. And I think perhaps the modern Arsenal side doesn't have it. Bob Wilson describes it as a jigsaw. You know, other people will say, you know, the sum of the parts. But it was just, he linked it all together. You know, the attack started with him, they finished with him. You know, he was just tireless. Just quite a phenomenal bloke. And the more people you interviewed, the deeper the feeling you had. You felt like you knew him by the end of the process. It was just, or you wish you had, certainly.
Yeah, I've got to be honest. I mean, reading some of the quotes about him before doing this, you know, it almost felt quite emotional. You could sense the emotion from people. I also looked on your YouTube channel, your YouTube page of some pics of Geordie, some clips of him on the ball. He struck me as a really intelligent player. Sometimes, you know, just the dummies, etc., that he would make. You know, he was a really exciting battler on the pitch, wasn't he? Very much in the Sir Sanchez mould that people would know.
I think the thing with Geordie was that he actually, this for anybody who's listening, he sort of changed the profile of a modern winger. Because in the 60s, when he first came into the side, taking the place of either an Alan Skirton or a Johnny McLeod, both of whom are in the book and both of whom love him, you know, even though one of them wasn't going to play as soon as he started playing, because Billy Wright changed the team such that you had one flair winger who was an attacker, full stop, and Geordie. Didn't matter which side, didn't make any difference to him. But before that, in the early 60s, most sides played with two wingers, and they were effectively two forwards. You know, you kicked them, they fell over. They certainly didn't come back and help their fullback. Geordie changed all that. And it ran as a theme. If you speak to some of the journalists, which I did, it ran as a theme through Arsenal. It might have been Patrick Collins. I'd have to refer to the book. And I think Paddy Barclay, although not in the book, said the same to me. When Billy Wright changed the side to have two wingers, one was an attacking winger and one was box to box. And obviously George Graham was in that side, benefiting from that structure. If you look at George Graham's first side, you had Brian Marwood on one side and David Rocastle on the other. Now, David Rocastle had plenty of flair and plenty of talent, and he's probably the closest to Geordie. But one was a box-to-box winger and one was an attacking winger. And then if you take it even further, you take it through to Wenger and you take the first Wenger side, you had exactly the same thing. You had Ray Parlour, the box-to-box right side of midfield, and then you had Mark Overmars, who was effectively a third forward. So it actually ran through 3 generations of Arsenal managers, and it started with Geordie. And it's gone all the way through ever since. It's not there now, but when Arsenal played 4-4-2, they played with one traditional winger, flair, attacking. Geordie had that as well, but he was the box-to-box, so it created a balance in the side. So the 4-4-2 became a 4-3-3, as it did with Ray Parlour and Mark Overmars before, in recent years. Yeah. So he started something that has run with Arsenal for nigh on 40 years, through various teams, and all successful ones.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me is the length of time he played for the Arsenal. This guy must have had magnificent engine and fitness levels of a modern day athlete, because he didn't just do this for 10 years successfully, he did it for 17 years successfully.
Well, yeah, but you look at the 621 games.
I know.
And not taking anything away from Tony Adams or David O'Leary, and I wouldn't dream of, but they didn't start and finish every game. He started 605 of the 621 games. There was only one substitute the whole time he played. You've got to remember that. You don't have the 3 subs or the 5 subs that O'Leary or Adams played with. You'd take someone like Steven Gerrard, similar number of games at the top level, but only started and finished about 450. So it's a very, very different thing. And bear in mind, the pitches those days were like donkey fields most of the season. And he could run, as far as the modern player on a pitch that was just muddy and puddles half the time. And there is a big argument, and we've all had it on blogs or on podcasts, I'm sure, that the modern player is a different game. They're more athletic, and they probably are. And I would not argue with it. And I spoke to Gary Lewin at length about this, who obviously knew Geordie well. He said the difference with the modern player is, to a Geordie or somebody in the 70s, they will run the same distance in a game. The difference is, it's like saying, well, I've run a marathon, but Mo Farah's run a marathon. The modern player will run the same distance, but he'll do shorter bursts and sprints a lot quicker. But Geordie was the exception. Geordie could play today. Everyone who played with in the 70s who watches football today said Geordie in 71 could play today. Not many of the 71 players necessarily in his position could do the same. He was an exception. He was a freak in the 70s. Absolute freak.
Another one of the things that struck me about him is his skill levels, as you've already mentioned. And there is that quote about putting the ball on the matchstick.
Yeah.
There's the famous winner in 71 at White Hart Lane.
Yeah.
Where he's... the pinpoint accuracy of his crossing. I mean, this guy is a battler on the pitch. He's pacey, he's got great work ethic, and he's got skill levels that could succeed in today's game when you look at them.
Well, we could do with his corners in the modern Arsenal side, I can tell you that, man.
I was about to say,
Santi Cazorla might be two-footed, but he can't lift it over the first man.
Absolutely. You've already mentioned this once, but it's a point I want to come back to. Geordie was one of the few backroom staff who covered the George Graham and Arsene Wenger years at Arsenal. As a coach, I mean, that speaks volumes for his quality. Also reading some of the quotes from some of the guys who he coached in his youth teams, etc. They're full of respect and love for the man. Any personal favourite stories that you've heard from those players he's brought through?
All of them, to be honest. I mean, the players who won trophies with Arsenal, Kevin Campbell, David Hillier, Stephen Hughes, Ray Parlour, they all loved the guy. I mean, they absolutely loved him. And some of them are coaches today, like David Hillier coaches in his spare time and has done. He still uses sessions. He said to me, I think there's 3 sessions he uses from all the time he was a player, and 2 of them are Geordie's. He still uses the same sessions. Geordie managed to combine the traditional coaching that he grew up with in the 60s and 70s with the modern coaching. He blended it very well, and it was never dull. All the players who coached under him, would say they went with a smile on their face, whether it's Paolo Vanazza, whether it's Kevin Campbell, whether it's Perry Groves. Because obviously you've got to remember in those days, Jason, it was very different because it wasn't the same by the end, to be fair. He wasn't enjoying it. It's not really in the book. But when he went back to Arsenal, the reserve team was the reserve team. And obviously, you played the same fixtures as the first team, just home and away. If a player was injured, you went straight into the first team. If a first team player was injured, he was recovering, he came back through the reserve team. It was very, very closely linked. So George would have been working closely with George Graham. He would have been closely working with Stuart Houston, with Pat Rice. Theo Foley, went, but in that they were all integral. They all worked together. Whereas by the end, Arsene Wenger's methods were very different. If you were anywhere near the first team or close to being potentially in the first team with much bigger squads, you trained with him. And if you weren't, you trained with Geordie. So the fun wasn't there for him. But when he came back in 1990, I think Gary Lewin said to me, being a reserve team manager at Arsenal would be, and then in 1990 would have been considered the same level as being a manager in the first division, or the Championship today. because it really was. It was that you had a mixture of young players trying to break through, players who were out of favour, players who were coming back from injury, and you had to be a very, very, very strong personality to blend that into a team that was going to function. Because they were either desperate not to be there because they thought they should be breaking through, they were desperate not to be there because they were out of favour and they wanted to get back in favour, or they were desperate not to be there because they were injured and just waiting to get back. Nobody wanted to play reserve team football. So to be a manager or a coach that made that fun and managed to blend a side says volumes for what Geordie's personality was, because nobody didn't want to play for Geordie. Even if they knew they didn't want to play for the reserves, they were happy to play for Geordie. And without mentioning names, and I haven't in the book, there are other coaches at Arsenal in the 90s that people didn't want to work for, but everybody wanted to work for Geordie because he just had that personality, that charisma, that humour that made even tough sessions fun, made trying sessions easy. He just had it, and everybody says the same.
He comes across as a real man's man, somebody who's able to get on with everybody and engage with everyone. It must have been quite an emotional experience for you writing this book, because you'll have heard from all sorts of different people, and those guys from 71, the McClintocks, the Rices, the Bob Wilsons, etc. Those guys had a real bond. To win a double back in those days, it's a lot of fixtures, as you've already said. It's hard slog on those grounds. They've got to have each other's backs. Tell me about one of the more emotional stories from the letters.
Well, there are so many, to be honest with you, Jason. One of the best stories that really sums up the bond, if that's what you're looking at, really is, and I think this made other people's biographies. I think it's certainly in Bob Wilson's. But when he passed away, it's the only time in the history of Arsenal Football Club that the whole club's been closed, because a memo went round to say to every department, bear in mind, we're not talking about 500 staff at Highbury House now. We're talking about Highbury Stadium, maybe 70, 80 staff across, whether it's ticket sales, whether it's admin, whether it's, the canteen. Every single member of staff, when asked, said they wanted to go to his funeral. So there were 3 coach loads coming down from North London, including the first team, with everyone, Adams, Vieira, Carnu, everyone was there. And when they took it in turns, really, to be, after the service, he was buried, he was Catholic, and the 71 side, it was pouring with rain, and the 71 side were all gathered around the grave, in their trench coats, their overcoats, and their umbrellas, and, paying their last respects to their friend and their colleague. And as they were doing so, Tony Adams broke away from the 2000, his team, and he came over to the 71 side and said, I'm overwhelmed by your togetherness. I envy you. No team will ever have what you had in 1971. You guys still now have it. And look at my team, however great they are, they're from all over the world. We'll just never have this bond and this togetherness, this band of brothers mentality that you guys from 71 had. And Charlie George just turned around and said, yeah, Tony, but this was fucking Geordie. As if that was an explanation enough. This was fucking Geordie. Everybody loved him. But, one of my favourite stories in the whole book that gives you a concept of how much people respected him. And bear in mind, I'll take 2 examples. And these aren't people who necessarily were trained by him all the time. You take Martin Keown and Lee Dixon, legends of Arsenal. And again, coming back to not using the word lightly, I'm not using the word lightly. No. Martin Keown was brought back to the club on Geordie's say-so. He scouted him when he was at Everton. He said to George Graham, because he left in unfortunate circumstances when he went to Aston Villa in a pay dispute. It was a big decision for the board, and George Graham had to have concrete evidence that it was the right thing to do, and Geordie provided that. But years later, in 1998, 5 years later, when they're walking around the pitch at Wembley, and they've just done the double, and everyone's just gradually going, and this is the first double since Geordie's double. In those days, a double there had only been 3 or 4 doubles in history at this point, so, and it was Wenger's first season. The magnitude can't be understated. But everyone had done their lap of honour, and they were gradually going down the tunnel one by one. And Martin Keown was towards the end, and he was just about to veer off in front of the Newcastle supporters leaving, just to go down the tunnel. And he felt a tap on his shoulder and almost a tug. And he turned around and it was Geordie. And Geordie said to Martin, he said, where are you going? He said, well, we're finished. He said, don't, just stay. Just stay, because you never know when this is going to happen to you again. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. He said, just stay with me. Let's just stay and just savour this moment, because in your career, you don't know how many of these moments you're going to get. I had it once. and I regret that I didn't savour it as much as I did. Just stay with me, Martin, just stay. And they stayed together. I wish I had a picture, but they stayed together in the goal, just chatting, leaning against the post, just staying on the pitch longer than anyone else. And Martin Keown says it's one of his favourite moments in his football career. So that's one example of the utmost respect and the bond that he had with people that he didn't work with every day. And then the best story, one of the best stories, unprompted quote from Lee Dixon. And when people read the book, they'll have a tear in their eye at this one, I think. But he said that in 2002, when he finished his last game against Everton, after 619 games for Arsenal, too short of Geordie, somebody came up to him and said, Lee, do you realise if you played 3 more games, you would have been the 3rd most appearances ever for this great club, along those lines. And Lee didn't realise, and he sat and thought for a moment, and he said, you could have overtaken George Armstrong, whoever this was that said to him. He said, you know what? Being 4th after George Armstrong's good enough for me. And he said to me, Dave, I meant it. He said, if Arsenal had asked me to play, obviously I would have played. But when I found out I'd finished my career 2 games short, I was relieved. I didn't want to be the person who overtook George Armstrong.
I think that just volumes, doesn't it?
I know. And I put the phone down in tears after that interview. It just said everything. It just said absolutely everything. Because these guys, yes, they worked with him. Yes, they loved him. But there was also the fact that, of course, of that generation, the early Wenger, the late Graham generation, or the early Graham generation, people who were in their sort of 30s then, they grew up watching him. George Armstrong would have been their hero. Kevin Campbell sat on the terraces watching George Armstrong. David Dean grew up on the terraces watching George Armstrong. Vic Ackers, who became his closest friend at the club, watched George Armstrong. These people who were Arsenal fans, they watched. Even Charlie George, when he was he was the Arsenal, he was a schoolboy, he watched George Armstrong from the North Bank, and it was an honour for him just to be on the same pitch. They all said it. He was everyone's favourite. He's the players' favourite. He was the fans' favourite. And that's why I've got a chapter in the book where I've interviewed all the fans, and a lot of them you'll know from Twitter. And when you read the book, you'll see, these are guys, they will say things like, there will never be another Geordie. These are emotive statements. No one has ever come close to him since. I mean, you think about some of the great players we've had at the club since the 70s. Some of these people would say, I'll never see the like again.
I think that's a really good point, because one of the guys that used to the pod, Steve, I remember listening to him talk about Geordie Armstrong, and I respect Steve a hell of a lot. He's a great guy.
Lord Hillwood, Steve.
Yeah. And he knows his football. And he basically said the guy's one of a kind.
Yeah.
And, that is testament to the guy's impact on the terraces. I mean, can you think of any other player who's had that sort of impact over 40 years since he's finished playing football? There's very few and far between, aren't there?
There are very few. I mean, there are a few. Rocky's one. Rocky's one. But then it's because they've been taken away from us. That's part of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, we talk with a sense of goodwill and joy towards Geordie. It seeps through the book. It seeps through the way you talk. It seeps through the way fans talk as well. Just how proud are Jill, Tom, and Marge of that?
Very.
Yeah,
and I'm just the biggest relief for me, to be honest with you. And I this will sound very cliched and probably very disingenuous. It's not. If I sold 10 books and those 3 were happy, I would have been happy. Because I had a ball doing it. I got to meet many people who I'd worshipped. I've met some wonderful people. I've chatted to players. I've had lunch with Liam Brady, for God's sake. My son's named after Liam Brady. I've spent time with Frank McClintock. I've spent time with Bob Wilson and Pat Rice. I've had an amazing time, and I've published a book. I never thought I'd publish a book. So all these things are wonderful, and the fact that people are buying it is obviously wonderful. But the biggest thing was going to be when it was finished. Was Jill going to be happy with it? Was Marge going to be happy with it? Was Tom going to be happy with it? And they are. And when Jill says, you've captured the essence of my father, and you've done, no one could have done a better job, then you've got to be happy with you've got to be happy with that. You've
got to be proud of that, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Funny enough, I was about to ask you what's your proudest moment writing the book, and I think you've just answered that.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously finishing it and seeing it for the first time in a hardback, and it's a concrete thing. In this day and age, where most people read off Kindles, I do. My 85-year-old mother, who's not into football at all, she follows it just for my sake, really. My brother ordered the book for himself and my mum. I went up to see her just shortly after it was published, and when I got there, she'd read the first 4 chapters, and she was asking me questions, and I said, I didn't think you'd actually read it, Mum. She said, well, it's not every day your son publishes a book.
That's not, is it? One of the things I sense from all this is, even from beyond the grave, George Armstrong is bringing people together.
It really is. And a lot of players, if you take the people I do talk to quite regularly, like Adrian Clark, like David Hillier, people I've become quite friendly with, Stephen Hughes is another very good example. They are really, really chuffed that somebody Steve Sidwell, never played a game for Arsenal, but worshipped him, considers him his mentor to this day. Ashley Cole would be the same. I didn't get to speak to Ashley as much as I like, but these people are actually chuffed. I mean, whether I've done a good job or not, in the end, they were chuffed that George Armstrong people were talking about Geordie for the last 12 months because they thought it was not good that he'd been forgotten, not by the club necessarily, but he wasn't spoken about. And suddenly, because of this project, because Jill chose to revive it, everybody's talking about him. And whether they read the book or otherwise, it's a great thing that people are asking the question, God, who's that Geordie Armstrong? But, what's all this fuss about Geordie Armstrong? Why do I keep seeing bloody Dave Seager tweeting about George Armstrong all the time? And I don't care. It's just great because, he's a great servant to our club from an era when tradition meant something, the Arsenal education, the Arsenal way, which he epitomised, it meant something. I know we brought back the Blazers and everything, but Geordie, he was Arsenal Football Club. And a good example, take someone like Greg Lincoln, who didn't make it as a player at Arsenal, but he spent many years with Geordie in the reserves. He made it as a professional footballer. He's now back at Arsenal. I think he's up with the under-13s and the under-14s at the academy now. And you listen to Greg, and everything he says, and he'll admit this, is what he learned from Geordie, because it's the Arsenal way. It's not just about football. It's about respect. It's about how you treat other people. It's how other people treat you, how you respect the traditions of other clubs. Everything about Arsenal was special. And I don't know whether it still is, but it certainly was when Geordie was still there, and he made sure of it. And that comes through. I hope it comes through in the book, that there is an Arsenal way. Because we hear that phrase, do we know what it means? The Arsenal education, the Arsenal way. People throw that phrase around. But if they read this book, they'll probably understand a bit more what it means. It's a tradition. And it's a way of being, it's a way of behaving, it's a way of treating people, and it's really, really special.
That comes through again in the way people talk about him, the respect he has, and you say something there, the Arsenal way. Just to put this in perspective for people, 27 years at Arsenal Football Club, third in the all-time list of appearances behind O'Leary and Adams, 621 appearances, 500 league games, a double winner, part of the second team to win the double. Intercity's Fairs Cup winner, the first European trophy the Arsenal brought home. And very aptly, the training pitch at Colney is named after him. I mean, I can't think of a nicer touch by the club than to name the training pitch after him.
It's down to Liam Brady, that one.
That was down to Liam Brady, was it?
Well, the family asked about some sort of memorial, because obviously they'd been... It's in the book, but they'd obviously had the big service at a large Catholic church in Cambridge where they lived. But there hadn't been anything in London. And Marge, his widow, had asked about whether there would be something near the club. And the club decided it was Liam's idea to do something just for close friends, family, teammates. And there was a service at Colney where Liam spoke and Bob Wilson spoke. But the idea for the marble memorial stone next to the main pitch, of course, the pitch where he sadly, collapsed, was something that Liam picked up in Italy. Apparently, it's quite common in Italy to have memorials for great players and great coaches of clubs that have passed away. And obviously, he played for 4 different clubs in Italy, so he would have seen this, Milan, Juventus, and it was his idea. And the club took it on board. And Liam's godfather to Jill's eldest. He used to babysit for Jill and Tom. They used to live virtually next door in North London, and Geordie used to go around and play cards with Will Foster and Liam Brady in the evenings. So there's a long, long relationship there. Of course, they were teammates for 4 or 5 years as well. Yeah. But Liam was the man behind the memorial stone, and as you say, fabulous. Hopefully it'll be there forever.
Let's hope so. I mean, the one thing that struck me about all this is not only was he a top quality footballer, he was a great father, a true gentleman, unassuming, modest, a battler, talented, skillful, a really intelligent football man. And that comes across in heaps from the way people talk about him. I can't think of a better person for somebody to do a book on, Dave. And I'd like to congratulate you on that. Can you tell us about any upcoming events that you have with the book, please?
I think people are getting a bit tired of this, but we'll carry on doing it. This Saturday we are at Pybury Corner with Jill and Marge, and his grandchildren from Jill's two children will be there, and Bob Wilson will be there with his wife Megs, hopefully. And Bob will be signing books for as long as people want him to sign books. Obviously, they have to buy them as well. But no, to be honest with you, these events, people are bringing shirts, they're bringing body parts, to be signed by these guys. Yeah. But Bob, as you know, himself has not been too well. He's fighting fit again now. He was away for the first couple of launches, but he's done the foreword for the book. They were very, very, very close friends, and he's desperate to be there. So, that's the event on Saturday. And I think Paul from Pybury Corner is going to be playing Motown tunes that were George and Marge's favourite songs. And I believe also the YouTube video you've referred to a couple of times by Arsenal Editor, my good friend in Sweden, who put that together for me, is going to be playing in the background as well. And they're going to be people eating George Armstrong steak pies, I believe. So that's the one. The next one after that, I don't know. I know that Jill is trying to persuade the club to get more actively involved and do something. Fingers crossed. After that, I will be involved at the Gunners Pub Christmas party after the Liverpool game on the 21st of December. So we have a bit of a gap to the next one. But, hopefully this will continue into the new year. One of the things we really have to do in the second phase is to get the book into a paperback format so we can easily ship it out to countries where we have a massive fan base, like India, like Kenya, like Nigeria, because at the moment it's just not cost effective to do it. And I'm reticent to have the book in the e-format straight away because, as you know, you've seen it, there's so many magnificent photos and you just can't do justice to that side of thing, on an e-book, in my view. But we are going to try and get paperback, early in the new year, and hopefully then more people around the world will be able to learn about the great man.
So. Well, funny enough, I wanted to ask you, book availability, obviously via Legends Publishing.
Yeah.
You can order online for there in this country.
You can buy it at the Tollington, you can buy it at Pybury Corner, you can buy it at the Arsenal Supporters Club. I mean, there's people thinking, why can't you buy in bookshops? You can, but we're actually officially not in launch phase, we're in pre-launch phase. So launch phase is the 28th of November, and you can already pre-order it at Waterstones, WH Smith's and Amazon at the moment for the 28th of November. The reason why we wanted an initial period is because with the best will in the world, they take 50 or 60% of the cost of the book.
Yeah.
So we wanted to do as many as we could at events for fans near the ground as we could to maximise, that potential before we went live on the wider audience.
And if anybody overseas was interested in selling the book, how would they go about that?
Selling or buying the book?
You're buying the book or actually selling it?
Well, I mean, that's not something I can really talk about, Jason. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm speaking to. And if anyone's listening to this and they want to get in touch and they would like to buy in bulk and sell it personally, they can. Of course they can. But I've been doing a lot of work with the Arsenal supporters clubs around the world. So we've had a reasonably large order a very large order actually from Arsenal Australia. We've sent an order to Arsenal Supporters Club France. We've sent a supporters club package to Sweden, to Denmark, to Norway, obviously where he's huge because he spent 18 months as a coach and is very popular in Norway. So we are doing that through the supporters clubs. I'm just now doing that in the UK. So I'm dealing currently with the Daventry Supporters Club, with the Norfolk Supporters Club, with the Scottish Supporters Club. So the idea being that if you buy a bulk, you can buy it at a discounted price and then sell it or pass it on to your members. So that's the current phase I'm in. And then, the next phase, as I say, will be getting into paperback. So it's cheaper for us to ship or to freight in bulk to other countries. And yes, individuals can get involved if they want. If they've got a website, they can sell it through. We're more than happy to do deals with anyone, to be honest.
That's brilliant.
The more people get to read it, the better.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. I'm just going to finish this interview off. I just want to read a couple of quotes for the listeners. These are from Geordie's teammates. If you want a reason to buy this book, from Frank McClintock, on the best crosses the ball in the game, he can land the ball on a matchstick. From Pat Rice, Geordie was a complete gentleman, would do anything for anybody. We all loved him and we all still miss him. From our very own Dave Hillier, if we are talking legend of a gentleman, Geordie would be first on the list. From Liam Brady, Everybody loved Geordie. All down through the years, his teammates in the 70s, all his kids growing up who eventually became first-team players, we all loved him. And then that generation of players he coached, they all loved him. So to sum up tonight's book special, it's not a stadium, trophies, or a badge that make a club great. It's the people. Whether it's the guys on the pitch or your mates you go to the game with, they are what makes a club special. So why buy a book about a man? So why not buy a book about a man who helped make the Arsenal great? Geordie Armstrong is somebody you should know about. He's a true legend of Arsenal Football Club. So please go out and buy Dave's book. It's Geordie Armstrong on the Wing. Dave, thank you ever so much for joining me tonight. It's been a real pleasure interviewing you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Guys, you can follow Dave at GoonerDave66 or Jill Armstrong at Touch of Powder. Thank you very much for listening. Keep it Arsenal and keep it Geordie Armstrong. All the best. Thank you. Goodbye.